Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for making the time to join us today. We shall begin by introducing ourselves, if we may. My name is Karen, and I am the HR Knowledge Manager for HR Solutions, and I shall be the lead presenter today. And I am joined by my lovely colleague, Asim, who is here to field any technical problems that you might have. Hopefully, of course, there won't be any at all, but she is here if you did just want to send through a message, and she'll do her best to see if she can support you. Equally, if we have time at the end to answer any questions that might be relevant to everybody, and you've popped those through, then I will look to see if I can answer them. Otherwise, if you've got some quite specific questions, or if I don't get time, then I would be more than happy to email you a response after the webinar. We will be recording the session, so it will be available on our website for you to view again if you should like, and slides will be made available if you want to request them afterwards. Okay, so we are here today then to think again about GDPR compliance, and this session is stage 2 and it's thinking about roles. So today we're going to look at the definition of each role, just so that we're all starting from the same level playing base. Who's who in my organisation, trying to give a practical understanding of where these roles apply. Going to look to answer the question of whether or not you need a data protection officer, the responsibilities of each of those roles, quite crucially. And then I'm going to ask the question, when is a processor not a processor? I imagine that through the course of this webinar today, it's a question that you might develop. So I've sought to answer that at the end. And it's always good to have some aims, isn't it? To have an idea of where we're going. So the aims I have for today's session is to leave you feeling that you understand terminology connected to roles within GDPR, that you're able to reflect in real terms on who's likely to be assigned to each of those, and hopefully leaving you to know whether or not you need a data protection officer. Can I strike something off your list straight away today? Hopefully you'll also have a very clear picture, or a clearer picture at least, on responsibilities that each of those roles have. And you will understand the difference between a data controller and a data processor, as certainly you'll see the definitions can be extremely similar. So before we jump straight in, I have got the understanding, you know, that some people do consider GDPR to be a little bit of a dry subject. I mean, if you're enthusiastic about it, then fantastic, you know, good for you, because it's certainly far, far easier to learn about something new if it's your passion. But I'm afraid that many of the people that I work with are HR professionals, and otherwise this is just something else that they have to do. So I am going to try and make this session a little less dry, and wanted to begin by allowing you a moment to cast your mind back to when you found out that you had some responsibility for GDPR and how it made you feel. Might have made you feel like this. You might be associating with needing a little bit of support, really. If you don't recognise it, this is from the Big Bang Theory, shameless plug, and it's where Sheldon had his World of Warcraft account hacked, and he was absolutely devastated because somebody got in and managed to steal his wand of untainted power and all his gold, amongst many other things. His flatmate comes home and says, "You called the police because someone hacked your World of Warcraft account." And when he managed to stop reading in the paper bag, he says, "Well, what choice did I have?" Well, what choice did he have? If he had been an EU national employee, we're going to find out. All right. So for those of you who are perhaps struggling to maintain interest, but know that you have to because you've got to get this right, you might find some joy in following this little side stream. So look out for this little games icon. It's going to point to wherever somebody might have some responsibility for breaches. And we'll try and answer this question at the end. All right. So then, going back to our dry dictionary of definitions of each role, let's do it. So the first role, first and foremost, is the data controller. Okay, the controller is the natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or any other body which alone or jointly with others determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data. So in other words, the data controller is the key decision maker, and most of the responsibilities for compliance with the regulation fall on the data controller's shoulders. Next up, we have the data processor. So the processor, again, is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So great, clear as mud. We've got a load of technical jargon and the same word is used to describe what they do. But you know, a processor may help to determine how data is processed. I'm afraid I struggled to get away from that word as well in giving a definition of the processor. The next role up then is the data protection officer. Very fancy title. Again, we've got the same legal jargon: a natural or legal person, public authority, agency or body other than the data subject, controller or processor, so somebody different, who under the authority of the controller or processor is authorized to process personal data for them. Okay, and this must be a professional. It must be somebody who has some expertise in data protection laws. Okay, it can't be someone who's just willing to take up the job, poor unsuspecting soul. They must be a professional who's got some training in this. And then the next one up is the data subject themselves. And I've chosen this picture because they've got a pretty easy time of it, to be honest. A bit like being at a serviced pool or a beach, you know, they can have information about their processing brought to them. You've got to put it in front of them. You're the one who should advise them of their rights. They don't have to go and find out about it, you know. And they can object, you know, they can cast you off and send you away when they just want to, you know, have absolutely nothing to do with you but sit and look at that lovely view. Quite simply then, the data subject is an identified or identifiable natural person. Okay, so it might be one that we're not too confused with. I did just have a few side thoughts though that you might ask or might not have thought of. So the protection, the GDPR, it protects people who have data processed about them in the EU, okay, and it protects EU residents. So this could apply to anybody who is an EU resident, and potentially then it could also apply to anybody who's not an EU resident but is having personal data processed about them for some reason in the EU. Okay, so it's a really wide-reaching scope. And I have addressed the issue in my previous webinars, which hopefully you've seen or are planning to watch again at some point if you're enjoying them. I'm saying EU. Of course, we are leaving the EU, but we are very much still going to be subject to this, you know, after the 25th of May rolls around, because we're in the EU, and certainly after we leave, because it has been written into a bill for us. So it also covers deceased persons. okay, potentially. They are natural persons by that definition, so they may constitute data subjects, but the regulation itself does not specifically address the data of anyone that has sadly passed away, although it may be that each member state can have some discretion to provide rules in this area. All right. And you should be aware as well, it doesn't cover processing of information about an established organisation. So your work telephone number, you know, your address where you work, that is not going to be data subject, you know, information. Next up then, we've got recipients. So two happy fellows here who've received something quite exciting. A recipient is also a natural or legal person, public authority, agency or another body to which personal data are disclosed, okay? And that's whether or not they're a third party. So basically, a recipient is anyone that's going to get to view the data, which stands to reason. Next, we have third parties you might want to engage with. And we've got the same introduction, okay, and third parties under the direct authority of the controller or processor are, again, authorised to process personal data. Okay, so these are the definitions that we fall back to. So to have a little bit of a break, perhaps, from that onslaught of information, I thought it might be worth a little pause here to think about transfers, not in too much depth, so don't panic, it's certainly not the focus of today's session, but if you think about those different groups that we've identified, the controller, the processor, the subject, the recipient, third parties, okay, each of those groups are quite likely to need to be able to pass information, data from one to the other. Now, where on this image you see the cogs floating in midair, it's those areas which are likely to be the weakest areas in terms of privacy and security. It's far easier to protect something when you know where it is than it is to protect something that's in transit, okay, and can be intercepted by professionals. And so I'm thinking about emails, uploading or engaging the services of a cloud, storage base, you know, however you're transferring information between people, these are going to be your susceptible areas. And if GDPR applies to you, which I'm sure it does, otherwise you wouldn't be here, I'm sure, you will also need to ensure that whoever you transfer data to is either subject to GDPR or can at least, well, even if they're not subject to GDPR, they need to be able to convince you and give you satisfactory assurances that they are compliant or that they've got appropriate safeguards in place. Okay, so at least you know that wherever it's ending up should be a safe place. So let's move on then and have a little think about who's who in your organisation. So first up, we have the controller then. Let's go back to the beginning. If your organisation is a direct employer, then it will be a controller, at least in terms of its HR responsibilities. Okay, if decisions are made as a business, then the entity as a whole will be a controller. But the regulation quite often requires us to name a person or a job role, which is the controller. So who could that be in your organisation? As we learned from the definition, this is really the person who decides what we do and why we do it. So it is going to be roles that are right at the top of the business. So, you know, not only could it be your company as a whole, actually, but it could be represented by the CEO or an MD, a founder, perhaps even the board or shareholders potentially. Might be people who you could name as the controller. Now, if you do that, then when you appoint an individual within your organisation to ensure compliance and ensure responsibilities for a controller are met, this appointment will not turn that individual into the controller. If you think about it, that person, their job, let's take managing director as an example, they're carrying out their job as the managing director, and so they're carrying out their duties on behalf of the company, the actual legal entity. Okay, so the company would still be the controller, and yes, you might point to the MD to take those responsibilities on ultimately, because after all, they need designating, but it's still going to be the company overall that's the controller. It's worth pausing a moment again to have a little think about any joint controllers, because some of you may be. So if you're an organisation that cooperates and shares the same database, for example, with another organisation, then you could be a joint controller. An example of this is given by the IAPP, who are the privacy professionals body. And they give an example of a travel agent and a hotel. Now, it might be that when a customer walks into a travel agent and books, a package of holiday, that the travel agent passes on the name and number to the hotel. They could still be independent controllers in that scenario. But if the travel agent and the hotel were to decide to join forces, and the travel agent and the hotel were always going to share the same database of information, then they may become joint controllers. All right. Another good example that might apply to a lot of people is if you are in a parent company and you have a few subsidiaries underneath you, and those subsidiaries separately would act as a legal entity. But if the parent company, the overall company, decided that it wanted to analyse something like employee turnover or sickness absence in each of its subsidiaries and do its own review, then it would become a joint controller with those subsidiaries, even though beforehand they could act as separate entities. So I'm not going to waffle as much as that for these other ones, so don't panic too much. Processor. Thinking about individuals in your organisation, line managers and just staff in general, anybody really that you employ who deals with personal data as part of their job is going to, in effect, be a data processor. Equally, there may be companies that you work with who actually act as processors for you already, or you might engage them in the future. Many clients have their own payroll company who does their payroll for them. These would be processing data on your behalf, as would an employee database. Quite a trend that employee databases are used to monitor absence, sickness and holidays and things like that, and they do all kinds of fancy lovely reports for you. They're processing data for you. You've decided what you need and they're providing that for you, and you only give them the information they need to be able to run that service. So these would be processes too. And then next up we've got the DPO. So a data protection officer could be an existing member of staff for you. It could also be a new role in your company that you choose to recruit for, or you may even decide to outsource the service. Now, if you do need one, or if you want one, then it's worth trying to avoid appointing an employee who might have a high risk in conflict of interest in taking up this job. So it might be advisable that you avoid the CEO taking up that role as well. You know, as the controller, you would want the data protection officer to support you in being compliant, and it's not always great to be managing yourself. You tend to put a tick in your own box, you know, so try and avoid that. But equally, try and avoid anyone who's got absolutely no interest whatsoever as well, because after all, it is going to be an important job, and you need somebody who's enthusiastic and willing to assert their responsibilities. Data subjects. So again, certainly thinking about yourselves as employers, these could be not only employees and workers, but also candidates. Could be contractors and agency staff that you get in, ex-members of staff who are certainly likely to be the most dangerous to you in terms of data protection anyway, if they're disgruntled for whatever reason. Also emergency contacts, references, and you know, any substitute contractors that might come in for your staff who are truly self-employed. So yeah, remember that emergency contacts and, you know, people's information that you get for a reference could be personal data too. And then recipients. Members of staff, as I said before, anybody who is dealing with personal data is going to be a recipient, but also recipients may not directly have quite as much to do with your, you know, internal runnings. So customers and clients, for example, visitors. If you get somebody walking through, you know, your front door, what can they see? What are they exposed to? You know, they might still be receiving personal data that you hadn't realised. Equally, your processors are recipients, and your third parties might be recipients too. And so these third parties, now typically third parties might also be a little bit less directly involved, so they might be any employee assistance programs that you are linked to, pension schemes, medical schemes, and benefit programs as well. So yeah, you know, of course, you might send over an employee's name, for example, so that they know who they need to deal with, but it's highly unlikely that you would really need to get involved in any other information that these organisations would solicit from your staff. They'd probably solicit it all directly and would never need to actually share it with you. So yes, you know, you might put your employees in touch with these third parties, you know, as part of your offerings as an employer, but you're perhaps not directly involved with them. But you might have third parties as well who you are a little bit more involved with. So again, these could still be your processes, employee databases and outsourced payroll systems. So do you need a data protection officer then? Is this something that I need to understand? Hopefully, this gives you a bit of a sigh of relief. It's probably unlikely that you will need a data protection officer. But if any of these three conditions meet you, then you will do. So the first one is, if you are a public authority processing personal data, then you will need a data protection officer. If the core activities of the controller or processor consist of regular and systematic monitoring of individuals on a large scale, or if the core activities consist of processing special categories of personal data on a large scale. Okay, so I hope that clears that up for you. Absolutely crystal clear, I think. Looking at the last one, special categories, okay, for anyone that doesn't know, that is just sensitive data. So that's one piece of jargon deciphered. Yeah, so clear as mud. Let's focus on having a little think about what on earth these bits mean. Not exactly language you use every day, is it? So core activities, we have had some guidance from powers that be. Core activities, they say, it means any key operations that are necessary to achieve the controller or processor's goals. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the organisation has to be, in the business of data analysing, but more that any data processing is just inextricable, really, from your day-to-day business activities. Okay, so I hope that does give a little bit of clarity. Is data processing something that your business really can't do without as part of its, key activities? Regular and systematic monitoring. What on earth does that mean? Well, regular, fortunately, is just, the sense of the word that we know it as on a day-to-day basis. It's just, ongoing or reoccurring at repeated times, or even constantly or periodically taking place. Okay. And systematic is about something that is happening or occurring as part of a system that's been pre-arranged, that's organised or methodical, that's carried out as part of a strategy, or is taking place as part of just a general plan for data collection. Okay, and monitoring is all forms of internet-based tracking, really, but it's not just restricted to an online environment. So yeah. I hope that helps. So you do only need a data protection officer if you think that these might apply. If you aren't totally sure, then I would suggest that you contact the supervisory authority that applies to you and explain why you think, that you are regularly processing data or systematically processing it, how you think it's core to your business activities, and so on. At least you can go to them with a bit of background in your question. So large scale then, what does that actually mean? Surely that is subjective. I'm afraid that we haven't actually got a specific number, which is not terribly helpful, but again, we do have a little bit of guidance. So large scale is thinking about the number of data subjects rather than the actual size of your organisation. Okay, so it means that an organisation who only employs just a very few amount of people, but nonetheless engages in really large scale processing, that could need a data protection officer, okay, because it's got a really large customer base, albeit there's only one or two people actually processing that information. Pointers for what you might want to consider when thinking about whether or not the word large might apply to you. Again, this is guidance from above, so it's not just me saying this. I get my teeth back in. You might want to consider the number of subjects, as I say, and this might be as a proportion of the population, so that in alone, in itself as guidance means we're probably talking about a huge number. Think about the volume and the range of data that you're collecting. Are you essentially going to be keeping it, permanently? How long are you keeping all the information that you have for? If it's an extremely long time, that might be considered to be quite substantial. And then consider the geographical extent of that processing activity. So what is the scope of your processing activity and how far-reaching is it? Okay, so we're going to move on then now and have a think about the responsibilities that fall under each of those headings. If you did want to do some reading before bed, it's Article 4 that you should turn to of the regulation for your reference. But honestly, it's quite helpful, really, I suppose, that there has at least been some quite clear direction about what these responsibilities are. I think it's more just trying to get our head around what that actually looks like in practice that we're all struggling with. So I'm going to try and decipher that a little bit today. So beginning again then with our data controller. I've got a few slides on this, so shuffle yourselves if you need to and get comfy, have a sip of tea. The data controller is responsible for many things under the GDPR, and I've got 3 slides here and it's not an exhaustive list. I've tried to pick out the really key ones and ones that don't repeat themselves, you know, too much to the everyday person like you and me. So the data controller must ensure that there is a legitimate lawful basis for processing data, which is all right, really. You know, it sounds quite big and important, but if you think about it, they're the people who have to decide why we're processing data, so they might as well at the same time work out whether or not they're actually allowed to do it before storming ahead. They need to also be making sure that the rights of data subjects are honoured and that data subjects can exercise their rights, which again, you know, might sound big and fancy, but hopefully is fairly straightforward. Just be accommodating, basically. Comply and demonstrate compliance with the 6 principles. So demonstrate is in bold, and I can't really stress enough that point. Reason being that it's one of the key differences from the Data Protection Act, and after all, this regulation has only been brought in because it's deemed that the existing data protection laws we have aren't really good enough. There's not really any teeth to them. They don't match the age that we're in now of everything being digitized. So this regulation does seek to force us all to actually take this seriously, and in order to do that, we've got to be able to prove that we're taking it seriously, that we know what they're on about, and that we're trying our very, very best to achieve that. So you need to demonstrate compliance, and you need to be documenting things that you do, which will come up a little bit in a little bit. So for anyone who is playing my game, so to speak, we've got the first of the icons here. So a data controller is also responsible for providing information to a data subject, and that includes informing them of a data breach that has happened and might result in a high level of risk. All right. It's also their responsibility to ensure that a data protection impact assessment is carried out if one is required. Okay, so if you've heard that phrase and you're wondering where it becomes relevant, it's relevant. A data controller is the one who's ultimately responsible for conducting one. So if you don't know what one is or whether it's applicable to you, I've got a webinar coming up next month that is going to be all about it, so please do join for that. It's also the controller's responsibility to make sure that they have implemented organizational and technological measures. Now, those 2 words are ingrained, you know, and appear many, many times in the regulations. So these aren't words I've just plucked out of the air. You do have to have both organizational and technological measures demonstrated to achieve privacy. Okay, and they've obviously got to be proportionate to what it is you're trying to protect. There's no good having inadequate measures. It's not going to impress them if you're regulated. But again, hopefully that's not causing you to panic too much. You know, an organizational measure could be something as simple as, you know, a functioning lock on a door, you know, changing your key codes regularly, organizing your teams so that teams that deal with sensitive data are behind a door or sat in the corner where there's not much football for, you know. It could be things as basic as that. Technological measures are going to be where you're getting friendly with IT, and you know, they are supporting you hopefully with clever bits of software and things like that that can help protect and ensure security in a digital way. A data controller also needs to ensure that they have implemented a sound data protection policy. Okay, so if you don't have one, where have you been? And if you do have one, it needs to be updated so that it reflects the general data protection regulation. Okay, so that's a really important move to be making. Certainly you can just update your existing policy. We are in the process of actually completing a whole new policy so that it is clearly, deliberately designed with the GDPR in mind. It's also the data controller's responsibility to allocate responsibilities, which is quite nice. So we kind of have help, which is good. And the help comes in the form of the processor and you know, any staff that might fill those roles. A data controller should really form a company representative working party that aims to protect privacy. So as part of that party, they should look to review practices of data privacy and security, any weaknesses that have been identified, you know, between meetings, and consider any remedies that they could have for possible breaches. It's probably a really good way in which as well that you can generate documentation to do that requirement of demonstrating your compliance. You know, you can show that you're keeping it current. You can show that it's something you take seriously because you've actually, you know, set up a framework to try and address it on a regular and ongoing basis. You know, if you think about the fact that you might put into place a policy, you might, you know, think, well, you know, that's brilliant, you know, here's my policy, you know, it's shiny and new, it's wonderful, and then it might be, but if it then, you know, sits in a corner gathering dust, or nobody ever picks it up and reads it ever again, you know, who's really going to remember everything that's in it and how it applies to them? So this is a good way of showing that you're actually living and breathing it on a day-to-day basis, and you can add that to your stack of documents that can demonstrate compliance. After all, you know, if we are regulated, the authority could, if they wanted, just walk in to your organisation, and I'm sure they would give you a heads up, but it could be easier for them to review, to check if you're compliant, than paperwork. You know, it's going to be very difficult for them to observe compliance. So the first port of call, as we understand it, is going to be your documentation. So in the same vein, having evidence of regular and specific training for staff, you know, is going to complement that very much. So, and you should look to try and make it flexible, and you should monitor that it's actually being completed as well. Again, no good signing your staff up for a lovely training program if they're not actually going on it, not actually completing it, you know, not understanding what they've just been subjected to. Your data controller also needs to be implementing state-of-the-art security measures where they can. So I spoke about organisational measures and how that might just be something as simple as a lock on the door. And that is still the case, you know, that is still going to be a basic organisational measure, but you are going to have to work harder than that and invest in, you know, in sophisticated, really, software, tools, thinking that you can implement in your weakest areas. And you will also need to then determine whether or not a breach is serious and whether it needs to be reported to the supervisory authority. Okay, that will be a controller's responsibility to do. And then my last slide on data controller before you scribble your hand away we've got the need to implement higher levels of security. So this is where anything could be particularly risky, and it always is going to concern any sensitive data or special category data, as it's called now, wherever there is information being processed that could be used in a discriminatory way, really, or that could be, lend itself to a high risk of theft or fraud, or is about any criminal convictions that you might need to understand about people that you're recruiting. Okay, so that's always going to be a high level of risk, and it's up to the controller to make sure that they are particularly protected and safe. And this one's really important to get right, so underline this one if you are writing. Your records of processing activities are the responsibility of a controller. So record keeping, and this is not just what personal data you're keeping, I'm afraid, it's a bit more complex than that. It is also, well, it's primarily about making sure that you are documenting your processes from step one to step the end, basically. Each stage of your process needs to be clear, who it's going to, who might have access, what the risks are, where it's stored, all that has got to be recorded somewhere, so that, again, an authority could walk in and say, I want to learn what your processes are. You should be able to hand them a document that means that they've almost got, a how-to guide on everything to do with that process. Again, join me for a session on record keeping later on this year. It's up to the data controller to assign a data protection officer if one is needed or if they wish to have one. And lastly, and this might be particularly interesting for anyone who operates in organisations outside of the EU, you might want to consider having some binding corporate rules towards data protection. This is a single set of policies that ensures the same level of data privacy across the organisation, regardless of location. Okay, so if you feel that you actually need to continue to be able to send data outside of the EU, then if you have BCRs, it's going to be your fast track really to getting approval to continue to operate outside of the EU, and certainly would be your justification if you were not able to obtain approval from the authority. A certificate of approval, that is. So we move on, and don't worry, because the rest of the roles are not going to be as intensive as that one. So a data processor, what are their responsibilities? Well, it's up to them to ensure security, and it is also up to them to assist in meeting any rights that are exercised by a data subject, such as a subject access request. Okay, you can get a data processor to help you with that. It's also up to a data processor to notify the controller and even the supervisory authority of a data breach. And if there is a data breach, then they would also need to communicate that to a data subject. And these are serious breaches we're talking about, by the way, not a minor breach, serious ones. They may be responsible for conducting any necessary data protection impact assessments. So, as I mentioned, a DPIA is something that is required for certain organisations. Otherwise, you just need to be focused on implementing privacy by design. Again, we'll speak about that in our next session if you're joining for that. And the data processor may also be responsible for consulting with the supervisory authority if we have identified those high risk areas that I spoke about just previously. Okay, so they essentially, if you're based in the UK, our supervisory authority is the ICO. they would need to pick up the phone to them, discuss the high risk that has been identified, what we intend to do, what measures we intend to put in place to continue to protect that, and they will either approve that, or equally, you know, there are some situations where you can attempt to justify that yourself and continue. Ultimately, the data processor, you know, and their responsibilities will always be determined by its client, i.e. the controller. We move on. The data protection officer. So, if you are looking to appoint a data protection officer, and particularly if you're going to outsource one, check that they know what article applies to them. You can be a bit savvy and throw Article 39 at them. This article essentially sets out a framework for the responsibilities of a data protection officer, and I've summarised them here for you. So they need to advise the controller on its obligations. So, you know, if you do have to go about the rigmarole of getting a data protection officer, at least, you know, they are going to be providing you with some decent support, or at least they should be anyway. They will also help you to monitor compliance on an ongoing basis and help you to make sure that everyone's adhering to their responsibilities, has got awareness, is conducting training and any audits that need to happen, okay? So again, that's great in terms of demonstrating your compliance. They will also need to advise on and monitor the performance of an impact assessment. And they would need to cooperate with the supervisory authority and be their point of contact if need be. It perhaps goes without saying that everything that a DPO does must be performed with due regard to the risks that are involved. Now, if you appoint a data protection officer, they will have the automatic right not to be unfairly dismissed. Okay, now what this means, for those of you who aren't familiar already, is that from day one of their employment, okay, if they were to come to you, if I'm speaking to anybody here who could be the controller, if they were to come to you and say, hi, how are you doing? I'm ever so sorry, but all of your security processes are absolutely rubbish. You need to scrap them and start again. And here's why. And you think, how dare they speak to me like that? You know, you can't dismiss them if they're acting in the proper course of their duties, okay? To do so would enable them to take you to tribunal and claim unfair dismissal, okay? They must never perform tasks that could result in a conflict of interest to you. So if you're to find out that they are doing so, then we need to seriously investigate what they are up to. And lastly, they should permit a data subject to report concerns to them. Next up, our recipients. So this is focusing a little bit on, well, your responsibilities to help recipients fulfill their responsibilities. So they should only be able to access the data that they need, okay? So firstly, make sure they're aware of that they shouldn't be looking at anything that is not imperative to their job, but also help them out, do them a favour, and make sure that they can't, you know, and this in essence, you know, is privacy by design. You know, even if they wanted to, they shouldn't be able to get hold of data that is not for them. They need to understand, and I think this is quite a key one for how employees can operate on a day-to-day basis. If you think about your receptionist, if you have a receptionist, if they were to just jot down a name and a telephone number, you know, let's say of a job applicant on a post-it note, you know, potentially that could be subject to GDPR. particularly if they intend or do end up keeping it, in their notepad or something, because essentially that becomes part of a filing system. It's for future reference. It's subject to GDPR. So your recipients, if they're your employees particularly, are probably going to need quite a degree of education about this. It's going to be a real culture shift in how they might generally operate. A real quick win could be, paperless desk policy. You might have that already. People might pay it lip service, and if that's you, then go out there and try and draw up some understanding as to why we might actually have to start doing this properly. But yeah, so there is a culture shift that we need to help recipients with. And in that vein, they should understand and practice privacy and confidentiality. Now, if they are responsible for any personal data, they need to understand that they need to keep that up to date, okay, with regards to the purpose of the reason that it's been collected. And very importantly, they also need to get rid of any data that they no longer need, okay? So if you've got, a local file that everyone's, who needs access has access to, and that's where everything should be stored. But that staff might be in the habit of saving something to, an email, or saving something to their desktop. If you've just gone to that local place to remove data, a piece of personal data that you don't need anymore, it won't be gone really if it's still on that desktop, if it's still in that person's email. Okay, so the better that everyone understands that things need to be removed, at particular points in time, hopefully the more likely it is that they won't produce duplications, so that you can be effective in your job of completely removing data that you no longer need when it's no longer current. And then, perhaps most crucially, they need to be able to recognise a breach. You, perhaps as controllers or processors, should be able to hope that you can learn all of this business yourself, go away and provide training or bring in training to help get everyone else up to speed. It's tough because you do have to drum up enthusiasm, as I mentioned before at the start, to try and get people engaged, because just lecturing is not perhaps going to do the trick, and nor is threatening, with disciplinary action, although that might be something we have to do, unfortunately, if people persistently don't do what we need of them. But you then need those people, when you're going about your day-to-day business, you then need these people to be your eyes and ears on the ground of where breaches are probably most likely to be happening, like that phone being picked up by that receptionist and so on. So they need to be able to recognise a breach to a security measure, and they need to know who to report it to as well, so that then you can decide whether or not it's something that needs to be taken seriously. And do give particular emphasis on digital security. Your third parties then. So you'll probably be dealing with many third parties who are subject to GDPR anyway, as organisations based in the EU. And so they are already required to adhere to the regulation. You need to be able to assure yourself that they are compliant. And so we would advise you to retain evidence of these assurances. There's nothing specific at the moment, I'm afraid, that you can ask them to show you, but hopefully there certainly intends to be anyway, data, marks and trust seals that organisations can try and obtain, just to put a bit of a visual stamp on themselves that we are compliant or accredited, and you would want to see an accreditation that's been done by the European Data Protection Board. Okay, but Certainly, if you know one or two things about GDPR and you know everything that you're doing, if you can hold a conversation with another party and they can mirror things that you're doing, you know, and you can satisfy yourself that they understand the level of responsibility, then, you know, that's a very good place to start. Certainly if you don't, then you may be accountable, you know, for any problems that happen with that data once it's passed into their hands from yourselves. And you would need to inform your data subjects in advance of passing any data to a third party, okay? And just assuring them that you've satisfied yourself that they will be acting in accordance with the regulation. So some of you may be thinking, well, I could be a processor and a controller, you know, maybe actually I'm just a processor. What do I do? How do I define myself? You know, and there's a few different reasons why it is important to identify your role correctly. Firstly, so you can know who's responsible for what. Secondly, so it's possible for, well, secondly, because it's possible, I should say, for some employers to be, you know, both roles in different transactions. So you want to make sure that you're getting your responsibilities right in terms of liability. And then also an organisation might have a supervisory authority, you know, that it has to report to if it's based in one location. And if a role is based in another location, they might have a different supervisory authority and therefore, you know, different jurisdiction that they have to adhere to or have to report to. So there's a number of reasons why it's important to get this distinction right. So a processor is not a processor when it's a controller. So a processor may determine how data is processed, but it may not determine why. Okay, so any questions that concern the purpose and lawfulness of processing cannot be determined by a processor. Okay, so for example, how long should I keep this piece of information for? That is a decision that should be made by a data controller. And if you think you're making those decisions and you're calling yourself a processor, you need to watch out. You can think of a couple of considerations that I have here if you are trying to answer this question. The processor must be able to point to somebody else, okay? It's them who is responsible for the overall processing of the personal data that's being collected. And you might want to ask yourself, why is the processing happening? You know, what is the role of those parties involved in processing? And this is actually helpful question because we do get quite bogged down, you know, with legal ins and outs, but this gives us actually the scope to have quite a commercial view on how we interact with other organisations. You know, the regulation does recognise, certainly in this current age, a relationship with one organisation to another can be very complex in terms of passing data between it. And so it does say, you know, that if all else fails, we just must be able to demonstrate who's responsible for what. Okay, so long as your responsibilities are clearly allocated, okay, then it should mean that between you, compliance with data protection laws is achieved. Okay, and that will be the bottom line that they look for. So we do have a commercially friendly approach. So we are at the end now. Hopefully you're not still feeling like this, although you might be certainly thinking that you've got a bit more head scratching to do, but hopefully it's food for thought. If you watched out for my little gamer icons, then you might have picked up that the right person he probably should have gone to is his data processor. That's likely to be the first person that he would have contacted, who was actually managing his, mystical wand or whatever it was. They would then need to notify the controller if they thought this was a really serious breach, and then the controller would also think, oh my goodness, this is awful, let's tell the supervisory authority. But remember, he as a data subject could jump to any of these in the first instance if he was really terribly unhappy about it. And, our worry is that people will go straight to an authority to make a complaint, and they will be knocking on our doors. So I'm ever so sorry. I can see a couple of questions, well, a few questions actually that have come through, and so I'll have a look and try and answer these for you in the very near future. Thank you for sending them through. If you do have one or two and you've not got them through yet, pop them through now before I end the slideshow. And if you've got any feedback, that would be great. Always want to know if I'm pitching it right, if I'm helping you to find things engaging, or any tips and ideas on how I can make it palatable for you. If you are thinking, oh my goodness, this is just getting worse and worse and worse the more that I learn, you could always come along to a seminar. Don't always put things like this at the end, but we've had some really great workshops where different companies all get involved and speak to each other and lean on each other, as well for emotional support. I am running some webinars, and the full day ones are great because we look at actually the mechanics, but crucially then actually provide you tools to get compliant, so you will walk away with a toolkit really for compliance, which is been proven to be really helpful to many people. And you can always give us a call, of course, as well. That's what we are here for and what we want to do. So thank you ever so much for your attention today. I hope that was helpful. I hope it kept you engaged, and I hope you felt that you learned something. Good luck, and hopefully see you for our next session in March on data protection impact assessments and privacy by design. Take care, all the best, and goodbye.